we are going to be looking at a movement in literature. Luigi Pirandello is one of the originators of it, which really transcends the bounds of what earlier had been considered literature. Think about a typical 19th century novel. It tells a story, right? It tells a story, there are certain characters, maybe lots of things happen. If you're reading a Thomas Hardy novel or a Charles Dickens novel, lots of things happen that can be described externally. If you're reading a Jane Austen novel or an Emily Bronte novel and so on, a lot of what happens sort of on the inside with the characters realizing things and talking and thinking about things and so forth. But in any case, there's a story here being told. They're identifiable characters. You understand who they are, what they want. You see a series of events unfold. There's a plot that's more or less a conventional plot. And you sort of know how to recognize that as a novel, for example. And something similar takes place on the stage when there's a play in the 19th century. There are characters, they interact, they tell a story, and there's a certain pattern of what you expect to happen. Pirandello upsets all of those things. He says at one point, or one of his characters says, "Drama is action, sir, action, and not confounded philosophy." And yet there's a huge amount of confounded philosophy in his works. There's a lot of absurdity, and so it leads to playwrights like Eugene Ionesco, for example, a French absurdist author who writes a play called The Bald Soprano, where ridiculous things happen all the time, and a variety of literary movements later that we'll look at in the arts as well as literature, where things are just strange. People cannot recognize what's going on as a play or as a novel. Here is Pirandello actually working with an actor and an actress, trying to get them to understand what's going on in one of his plays. That took more work than usual because his plays are so unusual. He was appropriately enough born in Chaos, Sicily, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1934. He was an enormously influential playwright, somebody who really took people's conceptions of what plays were, what literature was, and turned them on their heads and made them realize that they had much too confined a conception. You could go far beyond the bounds that were typical in the 19th century. His most influential play appeared in 1921, Six Characters in Search of an Author. It was the same year as Wittgenstein's Tractatus. It produced a riot in Rome. It was put on. In Rome, they couldn't recognize it as a play. They didn't know what that was. They rioted in something like the way that audiences for the first performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring rioted. It was like, what? This is a play? You're insulting us, and started throwing things at the actors. But then it moved to Milan, and it was a great success there. And so within a very short time, people all over the world knew about Pirandello. I didn't have time to insert them here, but I've got newspaper articles from all sorts of newspapers from 1921 that are discussing, the Tractatus discussing Six Characters in Search of an Author. And so it was a sort of immediate worldwide sensation. Now, why? Well, it really is very dramatic. It's the kind of thing that takes place, with the manager and the actors there on the stage looking like they're preparing to put on a play. And so it's as if from the very beginning, the play takes you behind the scenes. Here's the manager, they're looking at the script, they're talking, and then the actors mill in, and they're sort of discussing things as if the play is about to begin, and somehow you, the audience, have been shown what's going on behind the scenes before the play even begins. And then these characters wander in, and anyway, it gets increasingly strange. What are some themes, before we look at that play in particular, what are some broad themes to look for in Pirandello? One of them is disappointment. Keep in mind he's writing at the end of the First World War. There's a sense that the culture has let him down, that society has let him, and really everybody down. So there's this theme of disappointment, of discouragement, of disillusionment, of a sense that the social structures that had been there before really were revealed to be bankrupt. Hence a second theme, the bankruptcy of social norms, patterns of society, and for that matter of literature that had existed before, he now thinks we've seen beneath the surface. Yeah?
Are these themes of like disappointment like just in Europe? Because what about the Roaring '20s in America?
Good. Yeah, the Roaring '20s are something we're going to talk about soon. The United States in 1921 was on the verge of a tremendously prosperous period, and an exciting period in the arts and in literature and in music as well, but it was also something it's most famous for really the automobile, for economic growth, for productivity, for mass production in general, making a wide array of products available to people. And the same thing was going to take place in Europe. Now, something I haven't talked about yet, but I really need to talk about. At the end of the First World War, there was really economic devastation throughout the world, and in particular in the United States and in Europe. In Europe, the reasons are obvious, right? A huge amount had been destroyed by the war. It's maybe less obvious what was going on in the United States, but as we'll see, there was tremendous turmoil. 1919, 1920, those were incredibly difficult years. Government spending had kept the economy going at a very high rate during the war, but as soon as the war ended, all of that stopped, and tax rates were very high. The income tax went from an initial rate of 7% on the top earners to 77%. And so, and that was just within 6 years. And so there was a tremendous recession at the end of the First World War, here and in Europe, for a variety of different reasons. In 1921, both Europe and the United States were just starting to pull out of that recession. So the prosperity was soon to come, but it wasn't there yet. And as he's writing the play, if it's published and produced in 1921, it's probably written during 1919 and 1920, when actually conditions were terrible all throughout the developed world at any rate. Now, they were about to change, and so you might see a different attitude emerging by the end of the 20s, where the idea was really you pursue the absurd because it's fun, and it's a new and exciting thing, not out of a sense of disappointment and disillusionment. But at this stage, that's really still just slightly in the future, just around the corner, but it's not quite visible yet. Indeed, by the end of the 20s, we will see a different attitude, where there's a kind of playfulness, that it's not so much discouragement and disappointment, but a question of, hey, people have opened their eyes to the fact that you can do all these new things in music, new things in the arts, in literature, in philosophy. And so people start excitedly doing those new things, not really because, oh, the First World War have shown me everything I believed it was a lie, but because it's like, this is cool, this is new stuff, right? Things don't have to make sense. You can go in and you can have a play where the dialogue is ridiculous, but it's funny. And just think of the new comic possibilities, right? You thought of yourself as a comic author. You want to write things that are funny in a play. Well, there are certain things you can do. And then somebody shows you how to make a totally new kind of joke. And it's like, awesome, we can do this now. Yeah, let's do this. So within a few years, you're absolutely right. A lot of things that look like this were being done more out of a spirit of playful excitement than a feeling of disillusionment. But in this play, as we'll see, the truth that emerges isn't one of playful exuberance. It's one of, something too horrible to look at or talk about. And indeed, there's a sort of hopeless emptiness that Pirandello writes about here. We peel back the masks that hide the true nature of reality, and we either see something horrible or we see something empty. It turns out that beneath these social norms, these ordinary patterns of life, these ordinary literary forms, you peel things back and look at what's really going on, and either it's nothing, or it turns out it's something terrible. There's another consistent theme, which is that reality is irrational. What was the rationale for the First World War? Was there one?
It was stupid.
It was stupid. It was stupid, right? In a certain sense, it's like, yeah, what are we fighting for? In fact, that was yeah, I'm showing my age here. Country Joe and the Fish in the Vietnam War had this album that started with a song where, sort of went, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. Well, you might think the same thing about the First World War. People came back from the war and they said, well, what did we accomplish? What was that war all about? Even during it, what are we fighting for? And it really wasn't very clear. At one point, I think I mentioned, during Christmas, there was a lull in the fighting, and the British and French soldiers met the German soldiers in the middle of no man's land, had a big Christmas banquet. The commanding officers were furious, but they were sort of like, what are we fighting for? I don't know why I'm trying to kill you guys. You don't know why you're trying to kill us, right? It's just like this thing we're doing and we've been told to do. And so, hey, let's celebrate Christmas. Merry Christmas to you all, and then we'll go back to killing each other. Right? But it didn't make any sense. And people looked at the war and they said, this doesn't make any sense. Reality is irrational. It's not as if there was some clear reason for all of this. We are going to war because of this end and see this. No, they told people things like this increasingly as the war went on and morale fell. They had to say, the Germans are evil. They want to come to England and spear babies with their bayonets. And they show posters having the Germans do this and so on. But really, come on. I mean, the war was not being fought because Germany suddenly thought bayoneting babies. It's what we do. Right? And so really, it wasn't like that. There was this overall sense. Look, morality, well, yes. Reality doesn't make any sense. There is really no order to it. And indeed, one of his themes is that it's contradictory. And in some deep sense, it's unknowable. We get glimpses of its underlying nature, but we turn away. We can't bear to face it for very long. In fact, he goes further and says, really, there's no such thing as objectivity. There isn't even predictability in the world. Could anybody have predicted the First World War? No, nobody was expecting that. Okay? It was the kind of thing that happened. It was a cataclysm that no one thought would occur. Even when the war broke out, they thought, oh, we'll go off to war, we'll fight a battle or two, somebody will win, we'll go home. There was no sense that it was going to be a bloody conflict that would last for years and cost millions of lives. What makes Pirandello unusual, I think, among these authors is that he turns his attention to the self. And he begins to think, well, if all of that's true about reality, what is true about me? What is true about us? What is the self? He ends up saying there really isn't any clear identity. Now, it's a hard question in general. If I say, who are you? Or if I say, what is it to be human? That's a hard question to answer. And not just human in general, but be the very human being that you are. That's really hard, right? I could ask, what's essential to being a human being? And we can answer in terms of rational activity or in terms of making and producing or fill in the blank with your favorite theory of what it is to be human. But now if I say, well, fine, but what makes me me? What is the essence of Dan Bonnevak? Right? I don't want to just ask what it is to be human. What gives me an identity? What is it to be me? All of a sudden, we don't really know how to answer, right? I mean, what is it to be you? What's essential to being you? What gives you the identity you have? I mean, they're dumb answers, right? You can just say, well, hey, I'm driver's license number 972, blah, 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 right? I mean, identity theft, we mean things like that, right? We don't mean somebody else is walking around, they're now Dan Bonnevak. And it's like, now who am I? I don't know what to do because they took all my memories. They took all my, no, it's not that. They don't really steal your identity in that deeper sense. But what is that identity? What is it that makes me me? He says, well, there really isn't one. Okay, that question doesn't really have an answer. And in fact, he says, and here there are echoes of Freud, the conscious mind is really a kind of mask, or better, a set of masks we construct over this, well, mysterious multiplicity, I put it here, this swirling mass of stuff that's going on underneath that we really can't look at least can't look at for very long. Unlike Freud, who says, I have a theory, and I can tell you exactly what the nature of your subconscious mind is, Pirandello says, no, you can't. You have no idea what's really going on underneath. There is this mess going on at the subconscious level. It's very important, but we really cannot have a theory of it. It's really, in the end, unintelligible. He sees the self as highly plastic, adapting to circumstance. So, who are you really? Well, think about the way you behave, let's say, in a class like this. Then think about the way you behave when you're hanging out with friends. Now think about the way you behave when you're, let's say, with your parents. Those are kind of different, aren't they? I mean, how many of you would be happy to have your parents come along to class with you? Or happy to have your parents come along to, I don't know, hang out with your friends on a Saturday night? Probably most of you would think, I'd feel uncomfortable about that, right? And there might be practical reasons, like, yeah, if they saw what happened in the frat house, they wouldn't let me stay there. But really, I have in mind, why? Why is that awkward? Because you're playing a sort of different social role. You're in one role as son or daughter, right, when you're with your parents. You're in another role as student when you're here. And then on Saturday night with your friends, you're in a role of friend. And those are different roles. You take on slightly different attitudes, slightly different behavior patterns. You're playing a different role. There's a slightly different you. And now think about that with just different friends. Just zoom in, right, to the friendship relation. Do you act exactly the same way, no matter who you're around, no matter which friend it is? Do you ever notice differences? I mean, some of you might say no. I know some people who say no, I act the same way toward everybody. I have a friend who has met sometimes with Bill Gates, and Bill Gates' secretary has told him, listen, you're like the only person who is just you when you're in front of Bill Gates. You don't turn into a different person. Everybody else is kind of like, it's Bill Gates, he's the richest man in the world. And he's just kind of like, hey. Okay, so some people have that ability. But other people, really how they are depends on, who they're with and which friend they're with. I mean, I know I'm much wittier with certain friends than I am with others. With some friends, I'm telling jokes all the time. We're constantly giggling. With other friends, it's very serious, right? Or with other friends, it's mostly complaining. Oh, can you believe that? Oh, I don't know. Right? And it's like, what happens there is really, well, we find some plane on which to interact, right? And we interact on that plane. But that's only part of me. And so you might say I'm playing a slightly different role there. With one friend, I'm the witty guy who's constantly making clever quips. At least I think they're clever. And he seems to. That's why we're friends. Maybe everybody else thinks they're ridiculous. But with other people, it's a different role. Anyway, that's Pirandello's point. If we ask, who are we really? His answer in a certain sense is, well, there's no answer, right? We're just that. We're this mask with that person, that mask with that person. All of them have something to do. I mean, there's some reason why we choose those masks and choose to hang out with those people and so on. But nevertheless, there is nothing deep underneath this that we can at least understand. So he says, really, we take a bunch of different perspectives on the world and on ourselves. It keeps changing. And so much of what we think about ourselves is really a question of illusion. Here is how he himself described for a critic his own plays. I think that life is a very sad piece of buffoonery, because we have in ourselves, without being able to know why, wherefore, or whence, the need to deceive ourselves constantly by creating a reality, one for each and never the same for all, which from time to time is discovered to be vain and illusory. My art is full of bitter compassion for all those who deceive themselves, but this compassion cannot fail to be followed by the ferocious derision of destiny, which condemns man to deception. Pirandello is maybe the first author to sound this theme, but it becomes a common theme throughout the 20th century, that life is in some sense illusion, that we cannot bear to look at the reality underneath, that we've got to deceive ourselves. Self-deception is not just some vice, it's actually essential to life. Now, why? Why would anyone think that we have to deceive ourselves? The traditional slogan is know thyself, right? Self-deception is bad. It's some kind of vice or some kind of intellectual failing, maybe, but it's certainly something to be avoided if you can. Pirandello says, no, self-deception, yes, from one point of view is ridiculous, but it's also absolutely necessary. What are we trying to hide from ourselves? Yeah?
We have a moral standard that we believe every person should stand up to, and we often do not achieve that, and we don't want to see that we don't achieve that, so we see
good.
ourselves into believing that we are close to what we believe should be.
Good. There is one thing we're trying to hide from ourselves. We espouse certain moral standards. We believe certain things. We say these are our ideals. We don't live up to them. And so, can we admit that? Well, it's interesting that actually, on a traditional religious view, the first step is admitting that, right? In fact, John Calvin in the Institutes for the Christian Religion, I think, is actually giving you a 12-step program. The original 12-step program, first thing you do is admit you're a sinner, right? Admit to that failure. But why is that a step of a program? Well, because the claim is that's really hard. Most of us don't want to do that. And in fact, I suspect most people don't like the thought that they don't live up even to their own ideals, let alone some other person's ideals for them. So that's a hard thing to face. And it's not just maybe that you do things that you don't think are morally right. Maybe you fail to live up to your own ideals in other ways. Like what? You're not morally the person you'd like to be, but are there other ways in which you're not the person you'd like to be? Yeah?
Academically?
Academically, yeah. You're all too aware of the fact that, ooh, you never actually did that reading. Or, that you totally guessed on that problem and managed to get it right. Or that essay you wrote was really just off the top of the head. You didn't know what was going on. And luckily you threw in enough complicated words that the professor gave you an A, but you realized that was total crap. And so on and so forth, right? There might be things that are moral failings, other things where gosh, I got by the skin of my teeth. That was really, I pulled the wool over their eyes. I tricked them. I didn't really know what was going on. Or other ways in which you might fail to live up to your your own standards in some respect.
Athletically.
Athletically, yeah, you might think. In fact, as you get older, there's more of this. You have a certain body image. You think of yourself as still looking the way, well, whatever you thought the best you ever looked was. Somehow mentally, that's your picture of yourself. And so you might look down and say, yeah, I'm this middle-aged guy, or maybe past middle-aged guy, but somehow internally you feel like you're still 25, okay? And that kind of thing happens to people. You realize, yeah, you're not really what you'd like to be. Or maybe, you'd like to be an athlete, and you realize, yeah, this is what I think I ought to look like, and this is what I ought to be able to do, but you really don't look like that and can't do that. Yeah, never mind, this is an uncomfortable subject. I recently hired a personal trainer, precisely because I've been feeling this way. I think, yeah, I need help. But anyway, what else? Are there other aspects in which you feel like, yeah, there's this thing that I'm supposed to be and I'm failing, I'm down here?
Isn't
Yeah.
romantic deception kind of constant?
Okay, good. Romantic, yeah, or human relationships in general, right? You'd like to think, yes, look, I've got lots of friends, I've got a boyfriend or girlfriend, things are going great. But then you stop and think, well, wait a minute. How many people really care about me? Here's a terrible thought. Imagine that you're killed tomorrow, okay? You're in a horrible accident, or actually, when I was a grad student, I saw a student get hit by a car. I was on a very urban campus. 2 of the main streets in the city passed by. The light turned red. This kid was crossing from actually the building where I was toward the library. Car didn't see the red light. Student just flew up 20 feet in the air. We're coming down. Totally hushed up. I was never able to find out what happened. Actually, the news media had no reports about this. It's like, well, that student just flew like a ping pong ball. I mean, that couldn't have been good. But suppose that happens to you, right? Who's actually going to care? How many people come to your funeral? It's a gloomy thought. But suppose, now maybe you think, man, hundreds, thousands of people, they'll have to have it in the stadium, right? Maybe. But then you start thinking, well, Mom and Dad, or at least Mom, I'm pretty sure about. And who went, yeah, I got a hit. Then you start thinking, oh crap, maybe I'm not as popular as I think I am. Or you start thinking about those relationships. You say, well, so-and-so is really my best friend. We're so close and everything. And then you realize, oh yeah, I haven't really talked to him since we graduated high school, but still we're best buddies. Anyway, as your life goes on, there's more and more of that. We're like, yeah, that person's a really good friend, even though I haven't seen him in 20 years or blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, you can start doubting all of that and think, maybe I'm not really the friend or the husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend that I really thought I was. Well, in any case, he thinks that for a variety of reasons, we really have to hide our true nature for ourselves. There is a kind of 2-level theory going on here in Pirandello. There is the image of myself that I project that's there when I'm interacting with other people, playing a certain social role. And so that conscious mind is something like a set of masks I'm wearing. I adopt the professor mask, or the father mask, or the whatever mask in my life as I'm interacting with various people. And so that we can understand. Those are appearances, though. Those are the appearances of myself that I project to the world. What's underneath that? An intolerable subconscious reality. There is a reality to the self underneath that we really can't understand, but is intolerable in the sense that we can't look at for very long. If we really start thinking about it, we turn away. We can't face it. Now, whether that's really because it's so horrible, or whether it's because it's something in our nature that just makes us back away from it, I'm not sure, and Pirandello isn't sure. Unlike Freud, he doesn't have a theory of it. He isn't going to say, oh, it's because the id has these deep, dark sexual desires or something. No, he says, look, I don't know what it is. That's the point. Nobody knows what it is. We can't bear to look at it for very long. There is no meaning given, because we're constructing the masks, he says, and we can't understand whatever's really underneath them. We are the ones who are the authors of our own realities. So we're going to see in the play at a certain point the characters say to the manager, you've got to be the author. He says, what do you mean? Me, an author? I've never done that before. And they say, yes, you do it every day. We all do it. And that's the point, really. We're the authors of our own realities. We construct those masks. We construct the stories of our lives. And we give them meaning. But sometimes, and here he is different from Freud as well, sometimes the mask slips, and we have to confront the truth. This is something that later authors, the existentialists, refer to as confronting the absurd. And the absurd becomes an important theme in Pirandello. There are times when the masks slip, when we're playing the social role and then all of a sudden something goes wrong. I think I told you about my friend who was teaching a Platonic dialogue on the day there was a shooter on campus. And it was a dialogue about why one should not fear death, the Phaedo, where Socrates is saying there's no reason to fear death. And then the announcement comes over, there's a shooter on campus. Everybody stay in your rooms and lock the doors. The professor just shouts, every man for himself in front of the mask slipped, okay? Here he is, the calm professor, the expert in ancient Greek philosophy. Socrates is telling you there is no reason to fear death. Wait, somebody's with a gun. I'm out of here, goodbye. So the mask slips, and all of a sudden he starts playing a different social role. Well, anyway, we can bear to confront these things, but only up to a point. Okay, only up to a point. We can look. When the mask slips, we see the reality. My friend can realize the absurdity of his action and tell close friends. Okay, but it's not the kind of thing that one can look at for very long about oneself. It's difficult. Well, let's take a look at the play. Here is one set of actors who have performed this. Right at the beginning, the leading man says to the manager, "Excuse me, but must I absolutely wear a cook's cap?" The manager is annoyed. "I imagine so. It says so there anyway," and he points to the book, the script of the play. The leading man says, "But it's ridiculous." So the manager jumps up in a rage. "Ridiculous, ridiculous. Is it my fault if France won't send us any more good comedies and we're reduced to putting on Pirandello's works where nobody understands anything and where the author plays the fool of us all?" Notice Pirandello is sort of, this has a name in literature now. It's sort of erasing the fourth wall. I mean, basically the idea is Pirandello's talking about himself in the play, right? The characters are talking about Pirandello. Saying, we have to put on this Pirandello play. What a waste of time. Doesn't make any sense like everything else in Pirandello's. Nobody understands anything. The author plays the fool of us all. Well, anyway, the actors grin. The manager goes to the leading man and says, "Yes, sir, you put on the cook's cap and beat eggs. Do you suppose that with all this egg-beating business, you're on an ordinary stage? Get that out of your head. You represent the shell of the eggs you're beating." Well, the actors laugh, okay, and comment among themselves. "You represent the shell of the eggs you're beating." There they are. If you have last year's version, really it only differs because I put in photographs like that this year. But now, what on earth is going on here? What do you mean? You represent the shell of the eggs you're beating.
You're the outer appearance?
The outer appearance, exactly. Though we've been talking about those masks. Well, the shell of the egg is, right, this thing constructed to hide the goo inside and to keep it contained. So that is what you are. You are really just this shell around this goo inside. This stuff that is unbearable to look at. And so in this case, yeah, that's all you really are. You want to know what your real essence is? It's this. It's a bunch of fragments, really, of shells, a bunch of masks you wear to try to hide the intolerable reality underneath. Not that that's so intolerable, but I mean, you get the idea. It doesn't have any particular form. Here's another image. You are the puppet of yourself. "Silence and listen to my explanations, please," says the manager. He says to the leading man, "The empty form of reason without the fullness of instinct, which is blind. You stand for reason, your wife is instinct. It's a mixing up of the parts, according to which you who act your own part become the puppet of yourself. Do you understand?" The leading man says, "I'm hanged if I do." The manager says, "Well, neither do I. But let's get on with it. It's sure to be a glorious failure anyway." Now, what on earth is going on here? The empty form of reason without the fullness of instinct, which is blind. There's a famous quotation from Kant that is in the background here. At one point in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, concepts without, well, he calls them intuitions, without percepts, without information from the senses, are empty. But percepts without concepts are blind. So he's really saying, look, the intellect, without actual experience of the world, is just empty. We have concepts, we can't apply them to anything, we can't do anything with them. But information about the world, apart from any concepts that actually allow us to categorize things and classify them, is just blind, right? Give me information about the state of Texas. If somebody just downloads, let's say, some database, and all of a sudden I just have this mass of numbers, let's say. What on earth is that? I don't know what those numbers are. I don't know what they represent. What is this? It's not until somebody gives me concepts and says, wait, this is census data. And so if you look in this column, that is actually the census tract. And look in this column. That is actually a personal identification number. And then look at this one. This is actually an income level. This is how many people live in the household and so on. Then I can say, okay, now I know how to think about this. But if you just say, it is Texas, the following array of numbers, I don't know what to do with that. So Kant's point is just we need concepts. We need the intellect, but we also need real experience of the world. In Pirandello, that gets turned around a little bit. Reason is on the one side, the intellect, concepts, and so on. Yes, and it's empty, but without what? Here he doesn't say experience of the world, perception, or something like that. Instead, he says instinct, which is blind. Instinct. And then later he says, I don't have it. Rats. But he says to the leading man at one point, look, you represent reason, your wife represents instinct or emotion. And so he's concerned here not with a relationship between the intellect and perception or experience of the world, but instead the relationship between the intellect and emotion or instinct. Now, he seems to be saying intellect without emotion or instinct is just empty. But on the other hand, instinct is really blind without the intellect. So it takes both. Now, you who act your own part become the puppet of yourself. What does that mean?
You write your own story?
Yes, you write your own story, right? If you're the author of your own life, then exactly, are you really the roles you play? No, but you are the one who's playing them. So it's as if in every role, you're really a bit of a puppet. On the other hand, you're the one in charge of the puppet, too. You're the one adopting those masks. You're the one putting on that mask, or then taking it off and wearing that mask, and so on. So really, you're something of a puppet, or at least the appearance, right, is something of this eggshell, the mask. It's something that is like a puppet. But on the other hand, it's not like you're being controlled by anyone else. You are the puppet master of yourself. Well, these characters then come in, right? They wander in, and the manager doesn't know who these people are. They're not actors in the play, so he tells them to go away. He says, will you oblige me by going away? We haven't time to waste with bad people. And the father, mellifluously, says, oh, sir, you know well that life is full of infinite absurdities, which strangely enough do not even need to appear plausible, since they are true. Yeah, infinite absurdities. What is he talking about? Yes?
The randomness of life.
Ooh, good, the randomness of life. That's right, things not making sense, right? Things appearing random. Give me an example of some things that seem random. Yeah?
Like in war, like let's say your city gets bombed, you don't know why.
Ah, good, yes. First World War, not only the whole thing, but actually tons of occurrences within it would have seemed random, right? You're sitting there in the trench, you live. The guy next to you gets hit by a mortar shell and dies. What sense did that make? Why? Right? There's no reason. And so in wartime, that happens all the time. These terrible things happen, but seemingly randomly, seemingly without any pattern. Why does this person live and that person die? Why does that city get bombed and this one not? And so on and so forth. So yes, a huge amount of randomness. We notice it more in wartime because it's a matter of life and death and not just, oh, the bus left already. I guess I have to walk. Or whatever. I mean, ordinarily we don't die when these random things happen, but in a war, when they happen, people often die. So there are things that make us confront the absurd, like a door where somebody's written absurd. But now, what are things like that, where we confront the absurd, where we actually think, yes, gosh, there is an absurdity here. It doesn't even have to seem plausible since it's actually true. There are things that boggle us, that shake us out of our ordinary playing the role, and suddenly we are forced to confront the fact that we're just playing a role. I mentioned one, my friend, sort of fleeing from the classroom as an instance of this, but what are other things that suddenly make you confront the fact that your ordinary existence is somehow absurd? Camus is later going to talk about this. He'll refer to these as absurd walls. things that just you smack up into in life and make you realize that what you had been taking for granted is something of a construct of yourself. Yeah.
Like problems you make for yourself?
Problems you make for yourself. Yeah, like what?
Like cramming. Staying up all hours of the night studying for one test.
Ah, yes, right. Yeah, you stay up all night studying for one test and you realize, oh, I have another one too. Right? There can be that kind of thing where reality forces you to face something that you aren't quite prepared to face. Yeah.
Texas weather.
Texas weather. Yes. Yes, right? You wake up one day, it's still summer, even though it's October. The next day, it's like 53 degrees or something. It's like, what's this? Once in November, my mother was visiting Texas for the first time. I took her sailing on Lake Travis. It was a beautiful day. It was 85 degrees. All of a sudden, in the middle of Lake Travis, as we're sailing the boat, the wind shifts, these clouds roll in, and suddenly it's 48 degrees and very, very windy, right? And so before this, the photographs are like, oh, this is so nice, Danny. And then after that, it's like, and it's like, oh my gosh, that was my first confrontation with the sort of total craziness of Texas weather. But yes, all of a sudden you think things are going to go one way, right? And then something disrupts that dramatically and forces you to change plan. You confront the absurd. Now, the manager says, what the devil is he talking about? The father says, I say that to reverse the ordinary process may well be considered a madness. That is to create credible situations in order that they may appear true. But permit me to observe that if this be madness, it's the sole raison d'etre of your profession, gentlemen. The actors are hurt and perplexed. But what is he saying? He's saying, you think I'm crazy? That I'm talking about these appearances that aren't true? You're actors. That's your job. Right? To take these things that aren't true and making them seem true, that's what acting is. So now you can maybe see why the play has the structure it does. The point is, we're all actors. We're all acting our own parts. Or really, a bunch of different parts, different for every circumstance we're in. I'm right now playing my professor role, okay? But then I go and I act a certain part there. Then I act a different part here and so on. And I am, well, in some sense, just the collection of those different parts. But on the other hand, I'm also something underlying them that plays them. Now, there's a book that I've sometimes thought I would like to have you read in this course. I've never had the courage to actually require it because it's weird. But it's a very influential book early in the 20th century. Much of it was written actually in the 1880s, but it wasn't published until 1911. It's called The Philosophy of As If. It was written by a German philosopher, Hans Feinger. And basically he goes through all sorts of realms and says, we speak as if this makes sense, as if these things are true, but actually if you look carefully at them, you realize they don't make any sense at all. They're filled with contradictions. And it's really just an imaginary realm. The sign of this, that things are just a human construction and not a very stable human construction, is when you find contradictions. He says, for example, space and time. You might think, hey, if anything's real, it's space and it's time. Things happen in time, and things are arrayed in space, and they happen in space. He says, what is space made up of? Points. What's a point? Well, it's a location in space that has no dimensions, right? It has no height, no width, no depth. He says, so, I mean, are there other regions of space that like have no depth, no height? Say, hey, I built myself a house. Oh, tell me about it. How big is it? Oh, it has no square footage at all. Tall ceilings? Oh, no. Actually, the height of the walls is 0. Well, how wide is it? 0. How far back does it go on the lot? 0. How big is the lot it's on? Oh, 0. You might think, wait, that's not a house. That's not a lot. You didn't do anything, right? And he says, that's what geometry is all about, right? These points that actually, if you think about them, they are like, they don't have any size at all. They're so small, they're like zero size. It's a contradiction. Now, maybe that's a contradiction and maybe it's not, but that's the way Feinger goes through everything. You think that this is real, that that's real, that this is real? Nonsense. And he says everything contains contradictions. So I think Pirandello actually is somewhat influenced by this. Take any field of human endeavor that you might think represents reality, and it turns out to be a fiction. How can you tell? because ultimately, if you think about it, it contains contradictions. And that's what Weinger has just been saying. Basically, everything we speak of as if it's a certain way, but actually none of it ultimately makes any sense. It always contains contradictions. So it's merely an appearance. Anyway, the manager says, so our profession seems to you one worthy of madmen then? Well, to make seem that true, that which isn't true, without any need, for a joke as it were. Isn't that your mission, gentlemen, to give life to fantastic characters on the stage? Well, of course, the point becomes that's our mission too, to give life to these characters that are the roles that we ourselves play. So here are some scenes from this actually being produced. Here are the characters who come in and want to tell their story. And it's a very disturbing story, ultimately. Yeah. The father at one point says, each of us, when he appears before his fellows, is clothed in a certain dignity. But every man knows what unconfessable things pass within the secrecy of his own heart. One gives way to the temptation, only to rise from it again afterwards, with a great eagerness to reestablish one's dignity, as if it were a tombstone to place on the grave of one's shame, and a monument to hide and sign the memory of their weaknesses. Everybody's in the same case. Some folks haven't the courage to say certain things, that's all. Now, this sounds very much like Freud, really. There are certain unconfessable things that go on in the heart. But for Freud, he thinks he knows what they are. He has a theory of them. Pirandello makes no such presumption. He says, look, are they all of this nature or that nature? Does anybody have a theory of them? I don't know. Really, the point is, there are certain things we aren't willing to say to anybody else. We aren't even willing to say to ourselves. The stepdaughter, who you find out has been sexually abused, says, all appear to have the courage to do them, though. The father says, yes, but in secret. Therefore, you want more courage to say these things. Let a man but speak these things out, and folks at once label him a cynic. But it isn't true. He's like all the others, better indeed, because he isn't afraid to reveal with the light of intelligence the red shame of human bestiality, on which most men close their eyes so as not to see it. So, people do some horrible and unconfessable things too. But there's at least a virtue in recognizing and being willing to admit that, yeah, you aren't really entirely as you appear to be. That there's something more and something terrible underneath all of that. Now, the stepdaughter finds all of this contemptible. She says, oh, all these intellectual complications make me sick, disgust me. All this philosophy that uncovers the beast in man and then seeks to save him or excuse him. I can't stand it, sir. When a man seeks to simplify life, bestially throwing aside every relic of humanity, every chaste aspiration, every pure feeling, all sense of ideality, duty, modesty, shame, then nothing is more revolting and nauseous than a certain kind of remorse. Crocodiles, tears, that's what it is. So she basically says, oh, you're a big man because you can confess that there are unconfessable things in your heart. Well, boo-hoo. Now the father says that drama lies in all in this, in the conscience that I have, and each one of us has. We believe this conscience to be a single thing, but it's many-sided. There's one for this person and another for that diverse consciousness. Now it sounds like here like he's being a bit of a relativist, but I don't think that's really the point. The point is that with every role I play, there's a set of values, there's a set of standards, there's a conscience that makes me want to live up to the standards of that role. And so there are really many of these. Maybe each of us has one, maybe each mask goes along with one. So, yes, I found some good pictures of masks since last year. That's especially good, because like, that one's lit up. That's the one that I'm wearing right now, right? But it's just one of many. And each one goes along with a certain set of standards. How much do you care about that, really? Well, qua teacher, I care a lot about that. Qua human being, or qua this other thing, I don't know, how much does it really matter? And so there are things that, well, go along with certain roles you play. You craft a conscience for yourself by adopting a certain set of standards connected to those masks, those roles you play. But that's it. In the end, your self is fragmented. Hume had the idea that really the self doesn't have any independent existence. It's really just a collection of thoughts, feelings, perceptions. Well, Pirandello says it's more than that. It's not just the chaos of all the things going on in the mind. It's more organized than that. We have this illusion of being one person for all, of having a personality that's unique in all our acts. But it isn't true. Here, by the way, is a serious divergence from Freud. He says it isn't true. We perceive this when tragically, perhaps in something we do, we are, as it were, suspended, caught up in the air on a kind of hook. One of these absurd walls, in other words. Then we perceive that all of us was not in that act. and that it would be an atrocious injustice to judge us by that action alone, as if all our existence were summed up in that one deed. Think about people in history who are famous for one thing. One thing only. Like who? Who's somebody you know for like one thing? Rosa Parks, good. She wouldn't give up her seat on the bus, right? That's the one thing everybody knows about Rosa Parks. Is her whole life summed up in that one act? Well, Pirandello says, look, it's something she did, and it might be, in this case, a heroic thing and a very important thing, but there's a lot more to the person than just that, right? And so we have this tendency to sum ourselves up, sum other people up in one or a small collection of things, but that's not, the full person isn't really in that act. Think of other people who are like that. Amelia Earhart, yes, flew her plane, got lost somewhere over the Pacific, right? That's kind of the one thing she's known for. Gavrila Princip started the World War by shooting the Archduke. The Archduke got shot, so the First World War. Okay, in music, they're one-hit wonders, right? The Archies, Sugar Sugar, or the Baha Men, Who Let the Dogs Out, right? They're known for that one thing, that's it. Now, is their whole life to be summed up in that? Is all of them in that one thing? Well, no. And so really, there are these things people do. We tend to take them as symbolic of who the person is, but all that's in a sense unfair. There is no one thing we are. There is no such thing as the personality. There's just this fragmentation. Not all of us is in any one of those acts. And so, in the end, we're left in a situation of mortal desolation, where really, you might say, we all have to be the author of our own selves.